So I just want to say welcome everyone to the Codex Community of Practice. We are hosting this in conjunction with Vulcan today, the other fire accelerator focused on research. Really pleased to have you on board and really excited for today's speaker, Amanda, who I'll introduce shortly. I do want to quickly talk about a couple of things from the Codex perspective, which is some key Codex updates. And I just want to remind people about the antitrust statements. Codex and Vulcan and all of the other HL7 programs do operate under a antitrust statement that stems from the ANSI Standards Institute. So for the key updates, I just want to say welcome to Brian Van Oosten, who goes by BVO. BVO is going to be coming on board as our new Codex Member Engagement Manager. Really pleased to have him on board, and he'll be responsible for those things you see on the screen. Feel free to connect with him on LinkedIn, send him a note to say hi and book some time with him as you want to, and we'll send out a communication about this later on as well. I do want to take this opportunity to say a fond farewell to our program admin, Susan McCurdy, who's been with us for a year. This is going to be her last couple of weeks, so really want to acknowledge the effort and the impact you've had on the Codex community and the accelerator itself. So thank you very much, Susan. Really do appreciate all your work.
Thanks, Sunil.
Quick plug, recently the GenomeX data exchange use case held a connectathon at the working group meeting in Atlanta. We had a great outcome there, lots of lessons learned, lots of great conversation and lots of great testing. For those of you who aren't aware what a connectathon is, it's really bringing together the community and actually sitting down and actually testing the thing that we're trying to develop and publish. You'll see there's a series of participants there on the left-hand side. And their roles. If you are interested in actually seeing the detail of that readout, there is a link there, which again, we will send out, and also a QR code if you want to have a look at that right now. And just a big thank you to the track leads there, James Patterson from the MITRE Corp and Shrika Jamala from USC and Children's Hospital LA. And lastly, I just want to do a bit of a plug for our CardX public call that's coming up on October 28th. We've got some really great news to share there on that date. We have done a whole bunch of work in the hypertension use case. We're doing a lot of work and a lot of interesting participation in the cardiac implantable electronic devices work use case as well, which is really focused on how do we standardize some of the CIED space and provide some better outcomes there. And we're also preparing for the summit in November to prioritize the first batch of elements in a common cardiovascular lexicon called MCARD. Similar to MCODE, which some of you may be familiar with, we want to do the same thing in the cardiovascular space as well. So please, again, visit the link up there, which we'll send out later, or scan the QR code to register for that session. So with that, I do want to say welcome to Amanda. Amanda, I'll let you do your own introductions, but personally, I will tell you that I've listened to Amanda speak at least once, and she is just a fascinating person. So I cannot thank you enough, Amanda, on behalf of the Vulcan PMO and the Codex PMO. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you, Sunil. I actually don't know how to follow that. I felt so good about what you just said. I'm a fascinating person. If you've got my first slide to queue up, I'm going to just sort of introduce myself, like you said. My name is Amanda Borens. I probably have run across more than just Sunil here because it's a small community, even though we're spread out across lots of different efforts and so forth. I have worked for about 30 years as a data scientist and about in my 8th year of treatment as a cancer patient. And so I think that particularly unique set of characteristics about me and my unique perspective make me a person that can talk about some of these issues in a really open and critical way with a little bit of credibility, because I'm not being provocative and I don't have a personal agenda as far as careers go or organizations go. My personal agenda is really about helping advance the science and better access to better care for patients, right? So with that, I'm gonna jump ahead and talk a bit about my professional background. And on the next slide, you're going to see a long list of things. I'm actually kind of a unique and interesting person career wise, not, putting all of the other cancer status things aside. And the reason is that I just, before it was really common, I tended to move from one thing to another. And I don't mean move from one job doing the same thing to another job doing the same thing, right? I did this when it wasn't really common. It was really common for people to sort of get stuck in the same place and make a career out of that. And that's changed for sure now, but it certainly wasn't true at the beginning of my career. So I've worked almost 30 years in data science, and I've highlighted here just some of the things that are particularly relevant to this group or this audience rather, focused on data standards. I spent about 10 years working in electronic health records development. I specifically supported and developed and implemented the CoPath Plus product before it was acquired by anyone. I can remember going back to training sessions in Waltham, Massachusetts, where that little startup was just right outside of Boston. And gosh, I'll date myself. That was back in 1997, actually. And so, I spent about 10 years working on that. And that meant that I got to work with customers in Saudi Arabia and the UK, all around the world. I was really lucky. I got to be the one to go to 8 different Hawaiian islands for implementation and project management work there. But I also am going to come circle back and talk about some of that experience when I discuss data standards in a bit. Second category is just big data throughout my career, whether it was in geographic information systems and metagenomics and ecology, which is my graduate field of study, or massive amounts of data from reports in EHR, or medical device development, which was kind of the next category I wanted to mention to you, medical device development and clinical trial, where we eventually got CE mark and FDA clearance for our medical device, diagnostic device actually. But more recently, and probably more salient to this group, is that for the last 10 years or so, I've worked across global health, really. For about 7 years, I worked for a nonprofit where I was the executive director of data science, and I was the sort of the data liaison with 15 or so therapeutic area consortia within our nonprofit. And so whatever sort of data problem they had, it was my job to translate what was needed and how we would bring those data together and what that would turn into. And oftentimes that was a data platform. So you can see me sort of bragging there at the World Health Organization. One of the platforms that I and my team successfully transitioned to the World Health Organization was the world's first tuberculosis surveillance platform based upon genomics. And so not a small thing, and not without challenges related to security and privacy and sharing between sometimes, I wouldn't say unfriendly, but nations that don't want to be transparent with one another. So I've been really aware of regulatory processes, provenance, transparency, data sharing. And I have always been a huge advocate for as much open science and as much open sharing as possible, which is probably one of the reasons that I'm particularly excited about HL7 Fire and the M-code model. Most recently, I left my role as chief data officer in an international medical informatics company, and we provided secure cloud-based environments for hospitals and biotech, and that's going to come up a little bit here too. But the last note I want to make about my experience is that I have worked with the aggregation of data across all different data paradigms, from omics, meaning proteomics, genomics, whole genome sequencing, targeted probes, real world data, meaning electronic health records, patient reported registries, physician collected registries, natural history studies, randomized control trials, clinical trials that we convinced competing pharmaceutical companies to share with one another in a de-identified way. And so I think that particular thing really honed in me a desire for all of us to think more broadly about what data silos we have and why they exist and how much they kind of hamper advancement in science. So I'm going to go ahead to the next one and talk in a totally different direction about my patient journey as both a colon cancer and breast cancer patient. So in this one, you're going to see just a word salad of lots of things, but I use it for two reasons. You're a captive audience, and so you have to look at pictures of my baby. But I also aim in this slide to give people a good broad landscape level view of all the different things that happen. You know, side effects, comorbidities, the kinds of directions of treatment. And so I'll point out a couple of highlights there that I am currently being treated at 2 different NCI designated comprehensive cancer centers, but I've also had consultations at 3 others, right? And there's been feedback and conversation between those oncologists. 18 months of infusion chemotherapy. I think I probably have to change that 10 months thing. That's probably closer to a year now of hormone blocking and other drugs for breast cancer, 4 weeks of stereotactic beam radiation therapy, but on different occasions for different things. 3 major surgeries at 3 unaffiliated hospitals, and 2 inpatient stays of about 3 weeks total. And I always pause here to remind people who are working with data standards and FHIR and electronic health records to say, that's probably, if you're actually going to be harvesting data from hospitals, those 3 weeks are about what you're going to get from me. And that is obviously not at all a complete picture of what's going on with my treatment, right? Or my life or my health in general. So biopsies, you know, the really salient point here is that biopsies happen wherever the right facilities are. If it's interventional radiology that's needed, that's often on a hospital campus, in my case, a teaching hospital, but related to breast cancer, oftentimes there's a specifically targeted woman center, for example, that focuses really on breast oncology and screening and so forth. And so biopsies can happen there as well. 30 or so CT scans, more than a dozen PETs now, at least 10 MRIs, probably more. I mean, I've sort of lost count of all these things. But my point is that, you know, there might be a facility that specializes in a particular low radiation PET, which is one of the things that I've done. You might have ultrasound at a breast imaging center. I've needed to have cardiac consults and just regular healthcare for myself over 8 years, right? Seeing my primary care provider, dealing with the comorbidities that are side effects of treatment, but also kind of teasing out what are things that have to do with just regular aging and gynecology, just regular checkups, for example. So on top of all that, I've been a participant in 3 different clinical studies, and you've probably heard lots of people talk, maybe not as often from the patient perspective, but others have talked about when I treat cancer patients, they're always eager to participate and be involved, right? And that has been absolutely my experience. And over those years, especially in the 10 or so working across in global health, I have often preached a mission to my teams of data engineers, data scientists, and data managers. And that is that we're doing this, and when it gets hard or tedious, we're doing this for patients. And oftentimes, now that I've been a patient, I have to say that going back and looking with the lens, how often was I actually working on something that was going to directly benefit patients? Oftentimes that was really about accelerating drug development and trials. And so I think it's just important to make the point here that I'm not looking for a trial. There's probably not going to be something that's currently happening in real world data exchange that is going to help me directly. I won't be probably recruited to trials because of my complicated case and my strange double cancer, right? So all of those things are interesting, but it doesn't mean that I don't want to help and I don't want to share, right? So whatever I can do to advance the knowledge or improve treatments for other patients that come after me, I'm absolutely willing to do. So in my next slide, I'm going to talk about the fact that I have these two perspectives, right? As a person who consumes data and gathers data and cleans data and develops strategies for data collection as well as secondary data use. And then there's this strange parallel world where I felt like I was living in an alternate universe where I was at least 30 years behind technology-wise when I was interacting with my medical records or getting electronic health records for myself for a consultation. I'm going to talk about that just a bit more in a bit, but I hope at least that this is a really unusual kind of perspective and that, you know, I'm positive that patients are frustrated by all of the same things. I don't think that patients always realize how completely rational and realistic their expectations are that are not being met. So in the next slide, I'm going to just sort of give you some really specific examples of the frustrations that I have. And I'm going to start just as a data scientist, what have been my frustrations, and as a patient, what have been my frustrations. But then I'm going to just talk more generally across those different perspectives. So as a data scientist, I mean, I know that everyone who's here or will be listening later knows that interoperability and longitudinality are the major issues that we face. So in a callback to my slide about all the different places that I've gone for treatment, I want to say one more thing, which is that if you are a long-term cancer patient, and that doesn't even mean a metastatic cancer patient, right? A patient who's been through treatment and has surveillance, and sometimes things that have to be followed up with biopsy that turn out to be nothing. I mean, it's the entire spectrum of cancer care. I am unusual in that I have focused really heavily on working with teaching hospitals, right? So in general, I think it's important to call out that interoperability and longitudinality become even more challenging in the community setting, in a rural community particularly. So if I had chosen to go to the community cancer center as opposed to the teaching hospital, I would have a radiation oncologist at one office and a completely separate one for a medical oncologist and a completely separate one for surgical oncology. And on top of all of that, I would have a totally different place to go for imaging, and all those things would have to be shared between. So I'm actually, when I talk about this huge array of locations and points of care in my own journey, I think I'm probably the best case scenario. So I'd like everybody to sort of keep that in mind. When I talk about lack of interoperability and longitudinality, as a data scientist particularly, it was always very frustrating to me that in order to have longitudinality, I would need interoperability. There's probably not a place, if I use myself as an example, if I'm looking for a patient like Amanda Borens, I can't imagine that there's a single place where you would ever see a long-term picture of me, right? It's very spotty, sometimes here, sometimes here. And so a lot of the work that happens as a data scientist is identifying the data sets that may or may not be valuable to answer your research question. There's a long process of making data use agreements and legal agreements and dealing with security and privacy issues. All those data get pulled in. They're in completely unstructured formats compared to one another. Semantically, they may have variables that are called the same thing, but semantically they are different things. And I'll just pretend that this never happens, but it absolutely always happens where people are putting multiple kinds of information into the same variable. And so there's this huge effort to answer one question. And a couple of reasons that that's frustrating to me as a data scientist, especially working in the global health nonprofit space. I'm grant funded to do this work, and then it's useless, right? As a patient, I'm going to jump ahead to my thought there as a patient here because it overlaps. I hate that. No, I can go back to the previous slide. I'm just saying as a patient, I'll put a little lens on here too. I hate that stale single-use data set is something where huge amounts of money and time and energy have gone into investing, finding these data. And then that's the end of the journey for them, right? Because in my, I think completely rational opinion, all of that investment could be going to fix the problems upstream that create the need for these incredible long processes of gathering data. So the answer to that in lots of settings has been repositories, either repositories collected by Epic or your hospital system, or I think Trinetics is another one that gets discussed a lot. And those repositories have their purpose, but they will never tell us about corner cases or the impact of a specific intervention in a low income setting. There are lots of reasons why having a repository of a subpopulation, for example, or at least a random selection of patients in cancer care is not enough. And I will say why soon, right? But if I'm a data scientist and I'm trying to answer a question, I haven't been able to find things in repositories that will answer my question. Security and privacy presents this issue with never finding enough information from one facility, and also finding that regardless of how interested in cooperation and data sharing, the academicians or clinicians in each of these facilities, no matter how much they're interested in sharing, the legal departments and or administration of hospital systems have completely inconsistent interpretations of security and privacy laws, right? So you've got this issue where it may or may not be necessary to do this, that, and the other thing to the data. But as a data scientist, it becomes challenging when you're getting different sorts of interpretations from different facilities, and therefore you're getting different pre-processing steps. And you can't always account for bias, and transparency is compromised, right? And provenance, which is absolutely required for any sort of regulatory engagement, in my opinion, as a scientist, should also be required for any publication or academic study. So final kind of issue, and I probably have many more, right? But I'm just sort of hitting the high points. Extraction and aggregation and curation. By the time I get through this whole data sharing agreement, security, privacy discussion, gathering, cleaning, curating, semantic alignment, the data are already getting smelly, which is just my way of saying that in this day and age, what is currently happening in healthcare is not the same as what happened 2 years ago in healthcare, especially in cancer care. Things are moving so quickly that data really do have an expiration date. So as a data scientist, I'll just pose this question. Why can't I find out today how many patients have metastatic colorectal cancer that have been responding to treatment and are alive after 5 years? And I'm not talking about the 5-year tables or population studies that happened X number of years ago, right? Because that's moving so fast now. It seems absolutely absurd to me that my location tracking data is being used to raise ads based on all the people who are in the room with me. But for some reason, we can't have a clinician just sort of go out there and look and maybe consult with other clinicians who are treating similar patients. I think that's inexcusable. So as a patient, I have even more complaints. So yeah, I love to give these talks because I can just complain and complain and complain. I'm gonna just summarize it for everybody. I have a long list there, right? But I think the two stories about my personal care that I want to share with you all, and I make myself vulnerable and I share things that a lot of people would be uncomfortable sharing, purely because I think that this is what's needed to give people a sense that this is a real problem for real people, and that this is how data standards are going to help, right? So I had a recurrence of breast cancer because I have been dealing with colon cancer in my life, but am in remission, thankfully. I'm a complicated case, right? So I'm not just going to assume that this oncologist that happens to be in the cancer center where I actually happen to be is enough. So I decided I'm going to go to completely unaffiliated cancer centers that I respect in the country, and I'm going to get some consultations to see what would they prescribe as standard of care. And I am a data scientist who is comfortable programming in multiple languages and have been working in this area for almost 30 years. And it took me at least a week of downloading and requesting records. And, we have great patient portals at both my cancer centers. One is Epic, one is Cerner. I have better luck getting more information from Epic than I do from Cerner, but in both cases, I get a lot of text-based exports that are completely useless to a data scientist, which drives me insane. So it took me more than a week to do this. And I like to really drive this point home because this is directly impacting patient care. For me to go have a consultation, my oncologist wants me to start treatment within a week or two. This is not something that should wait, right? For me to go and get records to share with these other oncologists was going to take anywhere from 3 weeks to several months. That's how long these hospitals have said that it will take them to send records over. When those records do get sent over, we're basically creating a haystack around a needle of the information that they actually need, right? Huge amounts of things. Like, for example, if I'm just looking at your calcium level, I can order a calcium, but sometimes it's just easier to order a chemistry panel, and I'm going to get a huge amount of lab values that may not be relevant to whatever is happening with this patient. So, for me, I really had a moment of realization that the work that I did to hurry up and get all these things compacted into a zip file that was password protected, that I sent to all these different oncologists around the country so that I could be in there right away and then start treatment within a week, that absolutely would never happen with the average patient, right? So our lack of interoperability and longitudinality have a direct impact, a direct negative impact on the time to making care decisions. And then the second sort of overarching point that I want to make as a patient is that it's so frustrating to me that there is no clinician who sees the complete picture. There's no one. There's not any place where all of my records exist. And this had an impact just yesterday when I've been having a slurry of this happens every time there's surveillance, and I'm checking to see if everything's okay. And inevitably, I'm such an experienced patient that I don't panic, but inevitably there always is something that is concerning, right? And it may turn out to be something actually concerning, and it may be nothing, because when you look that closely at a patient, you always find something, is my experience. So what frustrates me is that I'm having this conversation with my oncologist yesterday about my hormone levels. And because I've been seen in another cancer center for colon cancer, for one for breast cancer and one for colon cancer, I have no place where she can look at the actual trend downward. And so in her mind, she's having this discussion of how, oh no, you've never responded to treatment, because the values that she sees are all high. But if you get the records from the other facility, you're going to see that actually there's a very strong downward trend. The selected measures that she was missing were at the other facility. So if you go to this other facility, you're going to think Amanda is responding completely. And if you go to her facility, you're going to think Amanda is not responding at all to treatment and should change. And the real picture is probably more complicated, but neither of them have access to this. And so, again, yesterday, I'm frustrated as a patient that I pay all this money to insurance and I fight these kinds of bills about whether or not I should have prior authorization for this or that thing. And the truth is that it makes it extra hard just to get insurance reimbursement to make these cases, right? And again, I don't think most average patients would be able to do this. So just generally, what are my thoughts about how things currently go? I think I have filled out so many paper forms in the last 8 years of my life that I want to set paper on fire when I see it. Um, it's very unusual for those papers to actually translate into something that I can see in my record. And, honestly, I mean, are we faxing? Are we really faxing in 2024? My teenager thinks I'm old, but to me, I mean, really, is that the best that we can do? It's just absurd to me that we act as though care happens within one facility and everything that happens outside of my facility is somehow not my responsibility. When absolutely the truth is that as a clinician, you're treating a patient. You're not treating a patient while they're physically here. You're treating a patient as a human being, as a whole person. So I'm filling out papers. It's not always getting in there. Somehow things are still wrong. And as a patient who's very active in working with my tumor board and my clinicians, I'm so frustrated about how hard it is for them to see things like my liquid biopsies and my genomics. I can't tell you how many times I've said, well, didn't I have a PTEN mutation, something, something? And then there's this scrambling to find a scanned in paper document that has a list of the mutations. And it's hard to tell which was this the one we did in August, or you know what I mean? It's multiple documents that we're searching through. It's just hard for me to believe that in this day and age, that's how antiquated our technology is for treating patients, right? So on the next slide, I'm going to talk about my experience as an ecologist. And as an ecologist, I have to share with you guys this beautiful moth on the left, which is a hawk moth, and on the right, these insectivorous bats. And the reason I share that is to tell you that you learn in evolutionary biology about some of these examples of very tightly coupled predator and prey interactions. And the tightly coupled predator and prey interactions both face really strong selective pressures that are in place because of their relationship. So, in my opinion, something that I have noticed while navigating all of this is that when I worked in EHR development, my customer was not the patient and my customer was not the clinician. My customer was the CIO at the hospital, and that CIO's customer was the payer, right? CMS and payers. And so, to me, all of the selective pressure that has gotten us to a current place with the electronic health record is related to the selective pressure of getting reimbursed and reducing cost of care. And that predator prey interaction is not paying for something and convincing the payer that it's justified, right? A couple of the other things that happen that we extract data from EHR for are pharmacovigilance, so safety monitoring after approvals, clinical trial recruitment, and trial simulations. In other words, how would this go if I use this population of patients? Can I predict whether my trial would be successful? And all of those things are totally valid. I'm not at all criticizing the fact that you have to keep the lights on in the hospital. I just like to draw attention to it because I think it changes some minds when you think about this very overtly. Think about the pressure that's been placed on our electronic health records. And I want to ask openly and have everyone think, what about more direct patient benefit? And when I say more direct patient benefit, I mean benefit to the clinician making the decisions, and I mean benefit to the patient directly as well. So on the next slide, I want to talk about platform trials as an example of how I think things should be. So it's a fairly new thing, but a lot of the folks here will have heard of the I-SPY trials. And if you haven't, I suggest you Google it. As a chief data officer, I worked very closely with the folks at Quantum Leap Healthcare Collaborative, who run the I-SPY trials, and with Dr. Laura Esserman, who's one of the PIs. And I was just stunned and enamored with the progress that they're making in bringing drugs in and out of the trial all the time. They're having to evolve their control arm to be the current standard of care because of what I previously mentioned, that's changing very quickly these days, right? So in a platform trial, regulatory agencies are requiring that the standard of care be changed to match what is current. And that means that they're constantly evolving that control arm, right? But for some reason, we don't think it's appropriate to do that in clinical care. So the amount of time that goes from a new discovery from a research study or a clinical trial into actual practice, routine practice, is an unacceptably long time. An example would be that I work with a teaching hospital and I said to my oncologist, this liquid biopsy was approved this year. Could we use it in my care somehow? And, that comes from in part because I'm a nerd and I love those kinds of measures, right? But the other thing is that I wanted to make sure that he was learning from it as quickly as possible. And I'm a good guinea pig in that case because I know how to temper my expectations, right? But my point is that I have a friend in Texas in a rural cancer center who has never heard of this liquid biopsy test. And it will be possibly more years before that gets instituted as a routine part of care. So it frustrates me that we expect drug companies to work in platform trials in such a way that they're incredibly careful to keep track of what is current. But my patient care decisions are being based on what we learned in studies that finished years ago, right? And that just doesn't seem right to me. So why can't my oncologist and tumor board look at similar patients in real time across care centers? Why can't they find out what's working? And what if I'm not an outlier? What if I'm a subpopulation and there's something that's really effective for people like me? And I used these examples in the photos, and you're wondering why I have a marmot and a skier, but I like to make the point, and a lot of people don't realize this, that cancer care is very off-piste. There's a first line of treatment for a set of conditions. Once you become a complicated case and have two cancers, we're really guessing at what is the right thing to do. Okay, so we're guessing based on experience. We're guessing based on consultations with people in our network. We're guessing based on my past responses to things. But why do we have to guess based on who my clinician knows or what my personal clinician has done and worked? Right? Why can't I have access to everything that's worked in the United States of America, at least everything that's been working, everything that people are trying right now? Why is there no data-driven decision making? And again, I'm going to just emphasize tons of genomics in my record, and none of them are actually readily available or in any way integrated with my clinical care. So on the next slide, I'm going to take a more positive turn. And I really loved this picture, so I decided I'm bullish. So what are some of the reasons that I'm bullish for a better tomorrow? And on the next slide, you'll see I have a lot of experience back with CoPath Plus and being the lead developer for the synoptic reporting module that comes out of CoPath Plus. I can remember in those very early days that people in the pathology lab, especially because we were working with anatomic pathologists, they were probably resistant to all of this, and that resistance was proportional to their years of experience, meaning that if I'm at the retirement stage, near retirement stage of my career as an anatomic pathologist, I have no interest in what you're telling me to do. Brand new pathologist out of school, so much easier to convince them that this makes sense, right? And that's always true of all of us. But what I have found is that in talking with folks from the College of American Pathologists this year, this happened 20 years ago plus, is that it has actually helped to standardize some of the free text notes. One of the things that I noticed about standardizing the free text notes is that it was closer to ensuring that a pathologist always reported certain things. So there was an inconsistency in these text-based reports in that sometimes we would mention T&M stage, sometimes we wouldn't. Sometimes we would mention this, sometimes we wouldn't. It would vary from one pathologist to another pathologist, and it would certainly vary from one lab to another lab. So the idea of creating these standardized variables was something that they were resistant to because, and I'll give you a great example. I can remember having in beta testing conversations with pathologists who were saying, you know, it isn't always an N1 or an N2, whatever, you know, pick a cancer and a thing. It isn't always exactly one or exactly two. It's sort of nuanced. And so what I helped develop with them was a chosen variable, which is the one or the two, and you pick the one it's closest to because that is what the Sierra standard is, right? But then in the comment that associates with that chosen selection, you talk about the nuance. And so that's both on the paper report and it's in the database and searchable. But if I'm looking at a population level across time, I really am only interested in the generalization of how, you know, it was generally a two. And there's going to be some variability, right? But mathematically, you can account for that. So it increases the access to standardized data. It increases its usefulness for research. It increases its usefulness for registry reporting, all kinds of benefits. And there have been some complaints about it, but I have to say, this standards community is probably very accustomed to the many ways that people criticize standards. But you really just have to move forward with something, honestly. So I'm bullish because I've seen that this standardization can work. So on the next slide, my personal experience with AI. So I do believe that natural language processing tools can help. I will caution and say that we are better served to work on solving the problems upstream. So my experience with the Metadata Automation Dream Challenge is that when I was at the Critical Path Institute, our team won first place. And you can see that the Apollo 5 score was perfect. And what that meant was we were taking unstructured oncology data from clinical settings, and we were trying to use NLP to identify variables of interest and to apply standardized nomenclature. So the 2.8 score means that we got just over half of the variables and standardized nomenclatures applied that could have been. And a couple of thoughts about that. One is, I mentioned in my preview of what I'd be talking today about what I used to think was worth time and what I now think is worth time. I think we are spending way too much time trying to figure out how to apply AI and natural language processing instead of going upstream and fixing the problem of massive amounts of unstructured text. And one of the things that I like to say to people in having analyzed these data myself is that even if you did have access to notes from patients at multiple facilities, you can't do anything to account for the missingness when they just didn't mention a diagnosis, right? That doesn't mean that that diagnosis is not there. So missingness is incredibly hard to deal with. And of course, there are mathematical ways to do that. And there are math nerds like me who are eager to try to figure it out. But it's just like setting off a Roomba in the rubble after an earthquake. I mean, it's just not necessary for us to do that. Let's just get together culturally and fix some of the way that we record data. So my next slide is another reason I'm encouraged is that I've had some experience with what I often think is kind of, oh gosh, it can border on unethical. The way that we extract data from health records for financial interest, meaning we are de-identifying the data so that we don't have to ask patients for permission, and then we are using those data to monetize access, which is a thing that monetizing access so that there can be clinical trials recruiting, monetizing access so that you can run particular studies. I have had the pleasure of working in a scenario where a huge research hospital in the UK was funded by Roche Pharmaceuticals to build a data platform where they had secure private access to patient data. And they funded them to stand up this platform in order to pay for a particular study of pediatric patients. And they had absolutely no problem with the hospital using that data platform for their own purposes as well. So, to me, that's a good example of how I think ethically you're still within I mean, if I was the patient, I'd be so happy to share my data with Roche for their own personal profit-based motives, but also so that my clinician could have access to my data in a more unified way. And I think we're going to see more of those examples. And then in my next slide, I want to just say all of these use cases are not mutually exclusive. So I'm not asking us to stop recruiting for clinical trials. I'm not asking us to stop extracting records for all these purposes. But let's all imagine a world where data extraction from electronic health records are helping every aspect of patient care throughout the drug development life cycle and also the clinical practice life cycle and research life cycles. So in this next slide, I like to say, let's think bigger. And what would I want my clinician to see or access to learn? And what would I like to access as a patient? And what would my ideal research data sharing look like as a patient? And this is the one where I often think, if I go back to my ecology experience, my graduate advisor used to say that ecologists had physics envy. And ecologists have to deal with a tremendous amount of chaos to the extent that mathematical models of metabolic scaling, for example, are incredibly complex. Predator-prey interactions are incredibly mathematically complex. And in ecology, rather than controlling for X variable, which is not possible in a full, rich ecological system, right? You have to learn to work in an entirely large system and extract information from that complex, chaotic looking set of interactions. And so I encourage us all to get away from physics envy and think about what we can learn in a real world setting rather than running a study, right? And I think that has been some of the hesitation academically and some of the hesitation from regulatory agencies, honestly, as well, is that when we run a randomized clinical trial and we have a control arm and we have a comparator, we are building an inclusion and exclusion criteria so that we can make sure that what we're actually testing and controlling for is the effectiveness and safety of this one molecule, right? And that makes a lot of sense. And actually, I'm very glad that we have this robust system for regulatory approvals. But there's really no way that we're ever studying all the complexities of cancer care by doing only randomized controlled trials, right? So I will never meet the inclusion exclusion criteria for any sort of clinical trials because I have 2 cancers and automatically that's an exclusion, right? And that's okay with me. I'm totally fine with that. But I like people to think bigger and remember that there is so much to learn from the actual data ecosystem of real patients in real time. And we can't currently do that because of these data standards challenges, but that's the future that I think that we're all working toward, right? So my ideal world would be that researchers are able to see my electronic health records rather than asking me to get an extra draw and fill out a paper form about things that are definitely in my EHR. I'd love to be able to add patient-reported outcomes to my health record. I'd like it to go both ways. I'd like to be able to share my data with a research study based on my choice, right? I'd like to be able to just say, yes, take a look at my electronic health records. I'd love my clinician to make all these decisions in real time about patients across not just his cancer center or his network of colleagues, but across the United States. And what I would really love is kind of a 2-pronged thing for patients that I've been thinking about lately. One is how we can democratize and equalize access across low income and low resource settings by using data-driven electronic data, electronic health records data. And I would love for us to all benefit from CMS and payers being able to get pushback on not paying or not covering certain things because of what's happening in current clinical practice, rather than waiting for a 2-year study to finish to say whether or not that's happening, right? I just think there's a tremendous amount of potential if we all think bigger than this is my hospital record and this is a silo that it's always going to live in. So in my last couple of slides, I like to talk about the Winchester House in California. If you haven't seen it, it's really cool. There was even a movie, I think, with uh, Helen Mirren, who's amazing. But it's a horror movie if you're not into that. So the Winchester Mansion is a place where a real person in the Winchester family was so deeply haunted by the fact that her family made all of its money off of guns, which kill people. And one of the ways that she coped with that with this was this constant adding on of pieces to her house. So you can see there's a door to nowhere. There are stairs in the house that go nowhere. There are rooms just out on the side of the house, and there's no way to get to them except, through a trap door and stuff like that. I mean, it's kind of a crazy house. And it's a cautionary tale from me because if we are not careful and we're not thinking about all these big picture things that I've talked about, if we're only focused on our little slice of the world, I think we're in danger of creating a Winchester house. So closing thought is really my specific suggestions. And this is where I'm happy to jump in with questions as well. On my next slide, I have kind of closing thoughts, and I'm not going to read through all of these, but I'll tell you, I think that we have to really think about an integration, and what does that look like, an integration of an electronic health record. If you use me as an example, all my labs, all my pharmacy, all of my pathology, all of my other things that happen, imaging, for example, not just reports, but images themselves. And billing codes sent between them to the HIS is not enough. That's not integration, right? That's not a research database. And so that and exporting scanned documents and all those things, those are not, it's ticking a box, but it's not getting us anywhere, right? So let's all think bigger than that, and don't launch a Roomba in the middle of your rubble. I think there are some really creative solutions that we can implement. I've talked about a couple of examples. I'm excited about, I only recently learned about the ENCODE data model on top of FHIR back in, I think it was March, February, something like that. And it got me really excited because it's one of the things that I've been thinking about is always collecting standard fields. The other thing that's got me a little bit excited is TEFCA, which is mandating. I mean, it's going to be uncomfortable for all of us, but mandating that there is a way for you to get onto this superhighway is probably the push and the selective pressure that we're all going to need. So, my closing thought is, what if a standard health information exchange included patient-reported outcomes as well? And with that, if there are questions, Sunil, you said people in the chat maybe?
Yeah, thank you. I don't have any questions in the chat, but you're welcome to. Thank you, Bob. Over to you. First question.
Hi, Amanda. Great talk.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your insights. Bob Miller, I'm the Chief Medical Officer for CancerLink, which is a cancer big data platform aggregating EHR data. And so, I guess my question for you is, we are currently building an application that is something similar to what your vision was, which is patients like mine. Show me a patient that doesn't necessarily meet all the guidelines because of comorbidities or second cancer or other things. But what happened in the real world data? And so we have a database of 8 million patients. And so, there may not be, an exact clone of Amanda Borens, but there's probably other patients like that. And again, I'm not suggesting we've solved all the interoperability challenges and the missingness issue is going to be there. My question for you really is, as asking you to speak as a patient, is if your clinician could have access to such a system, but recognizing that the main challenge with real world data is bias that you can't see, that you can't recognize that there's bias. Would you as a patient be comfortable if those recommendations, the recommendations from your clinician, were informed, at least in part, again with full disclosure, saying, this is, don't try this at home, kids. This is something that is. Would you be comfortable as a patient with those kind of recommendations coming to influence your care if it came from real world data as it exists today?
I think under a couple of examples, I would. Sorry, with a couple of caveats, I would. I think that, even if all it did was Dr. Scott was able to talk to other oncologists with similar patients about their experience, and share notes on why they tried this and why they tried that and what they wish they hadn't done. I think that for me, building virtual tumor boards from oncologists in different locations with similar patients would be an interesting prospect. And then the second caveat is that I'm okay with the missing this part of it. I'm okay with the bias part of it because it's the best that we can do right now. And honestly, that's what my oncologist does, is the best that he can do with what he has right now. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I think if you gave him additional information, he's an incredible oncologist and researcher, right? So he knows about anecdotal evidence as opposed to RCT based evidence. And I think that a really responsible clinician would be able to translate what the lessons could be and also be honest with me. So in this conversation with me, the way that would go is, I know this from this study and I know this from that study, because he's kind of accustomed to quoting studies for me. I know this from this study and I know that, but honestly, Amanda, I just have a feeling this is what I would do if I were you. Right. And it's just kind of a gut response. And he's careful to tell me the difference between here's my gut and here's this study and here's that study. And you know what I mean? I think as long as there's transparency in what those data sources look like, I think that's fine.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the question, Bob. Good to see you. Any other questions for Amanda while we have her on the line? Feel free to come off mute and just ask away. James.
Hey, I was just curious in the combination of research data and clinical data. What is your anticipation of how that would look? And are we still kind of beholden to EHRs like Epic being in both places in the near term? Presumably Tefka would help with something like that, but what are your thoughts there?
So I've already seen some really good work at a couple of cancer hospitals in Australia and a couple in the UK where, unfortunately we don't have the benefit of a single payer system. So they have kind of unified health records in that way. But I've seen a couple of examples where they have created cloud-based, what the UK term for it is trusted research environments. And so, you hear that a lot there. You don't hear that much here, but we kind of have a concept of what a cloud-based secure environment would look like. So the company that I previously worked for provided cloud-based environments that met all of the criteria the NHS set aside for trusted research environments. They were audited. They were, saved so that you could go back and look at the provenance. It helped with reproduction of results and so forth. But the way that they were using it was twofold, and I loved this. One was real-time dashboards, like the example that I gave in my slide at Great Ormond Street Hospital. They were working with patients in the cardiac intensive care unit, and those were actual patients, but they were looking across the board and should we be monitoring, modifying our standard of how often we do this or that thing. So in real-time learning. So they were having what the equivalent of our tumor board discussions using data from those dashboards. Now that was different because those were physicians working in a cardiac care unit. So those were their patients, right? So the other scenario that they had, which I loved, was that they would allow researchers so in my case, Dr. Scott is also a researcher. He could go and request from the Epic team in this case, he could go request a particular thing, like, I would like to see all of the patients with colorectal cancer, stages 2 to 4, whatever, you know what I mean? You could give the criteria and get that. And so what they do is they de-identify or limit that data set, put it into that secure research environment. And what they're doing is either hypothesis generation or bringing their own research data into the same environment. And there was a really cool study published by the Royal Marsden in London, where they combined data from real world setting and their clinical research to say, okay, in the real world setting, how closely is this matching what we found in our controlled experiments, right? And how much of an impact is that making when you account for all the extra variability based on comorbidities and things like that. So I think we're going to start seeing more of that. I hate that electronic health records are developed in the US and the world follows, right? I mean, we really drive a lot of the innovation, but I hate that the access to a more complete health record is causing them to have access to more advancements that Americans don't have access to. We're really unequal in several ways. But I think that that's something that could be done now. I think that hospitals in the US should have access to, at the very minimum, their own patients for research. And I just think that that example that I gave, where you have limited de-identified access to patient data with a secure environment where you can bring both kinds of data. In other words, you know, I'm not so interested in having a place to go into Epic and then a separate place to go into REDCap. I'd like them to be together in one place. That makes sense. That's what the future looks like to me.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, James. We are over, but again, thanks to Amanda for staying on the line. Are there any other final questions before we close the call? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone putting the hand up or unmuting. So with that, Amanda, thank you again so much. Love the storytelling, and your presentation was fantastic. And I love the bullishness you've got, particularly with your unique insights over your career and cancer journey. So thanks so much again for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.